For 31 years, Eleanor Whitfield made a house a home. She raised 2 kids inside those walls, refinished the oak kitchen table with her own hands, and planted a garden so beautiful that neighbors slowed their cars every spring just to look at it. Then, 3 weeks after her 58th birthday, her husband slid a manila folder across that same kitchen table. Divorce papers. And because of a document she had signed 30 years earlier without reading it closely, the house, the garden, the table, all of it, stayed with him. Eleanor walked out with 2 suitcases, an old Honda with 190,000 miles on it, and one thing Richard never thought to take from her: a rusted key to her father's abandoned tiny home, rotting in the woods of eastern Tennessee. What she did with that key changed her entire life. But to understand why it mattered so much, you need to see what she lost first. Eleanor married Richard in 1993 in a small church ceremony with borrowed flowers and a dress her mother altered by hand. She was 27, he was 30, ambitious, already climbing at a regional insurance firm, and his parents insisted on one condition before the wedding: a prenuptial agreement. The house Richard's family helped purchase would remain his, no matter what. Eleanor signed it at a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon. She remembered thinking it was just paperwork, a formality between 2 people who loved each other. What could a piece of paper matter when you're planning 50 years together? For a long time, it didn't matter. Eleanor gave up her job at a landscaping company when their daughter was born, then stayed home when their son arrived 2 years later. She packed lunches, coached softball, drove carpools, and held the family together through Richard's long hours and longer business trips. When his mother got sick, Eleanor was the one who cared for her for 3 years, spooning soup, changing sheets, sitting through the hard nights. Not Richard. Eleanor. The kids grew up and moved away. One to Denver, one to Charlotte. The house got quiet, and somewhere in that quiet, Richard drifted. He came home later. He guarded his phone. Eleanor noticed, the way wives always notice, but she told herself it was a phase, a rough patch. 31 years builds a lot of benefit of the doubt. Then came the folder on the kitchen table. Richard didn't even sit down. He stood by the counter with his car keys in his hand and told her he had been seeing someone from his office for 2 years, that he wanted to start over, and that his lawyer said everything was already handled. Handled, that was the word he used for the end of her entire adult life. In the courtroom that spring, Eleanor's lawyer did what he could, but the prenup was ironclad. The house belonged to Richard and always had. The retirement accounts were mostly in his name. After fees, Eleanor walked away with a settlement of about $11,000, her car and her clothes. 31 years of unpaid labor, valued at less than a used pickup truck. She spent the first 2 weeks on her sister's pull-out couch in Knoxville, staring at the ceiling, running the math on the rest of her life. 58 years old, with no recent work history, no house, and no plan. So when her sister brought down a dusty shoebox from the attic, Eleanor almost didn't open it. It was her father's, the last of his things after he passed 6 years earlier. Inside were his reading glasses, a pocket watch that no longer ticked, a stack of photographs, and an envelope with her name on it in his blocky carpenter's handwriting. Inside the envelope was a property deed for 4 acres outside a small town in the Tennessee hills, and taped to the deed, a single rusted key. Eleanor knew the place. Her father, Walter, had built a tiny home out there in the 90s, a 400-square-foot cabin he put together on weekends with his own 2 hands. He called it his thinking house. She had visited maybe twice as a young woman, rolled her eyes at the outhouse, and forgotten about it. After his death, the deed transferred to her, and in the fog of grief and a busy life, she had genuinely forgotten she owned it. Richard had forgotten too. His lawyers never touched it, because it was inherited property in her name alone, the one thing the prenup couldn't reach. The next morning, Eleanor drove 2 hours down a winding state highway, then turned onto a gravel road swallowed by overgrown branches. When the trees finally opened up, her heart sank. The tiny home was a ruin. The front porch had rotted through. Boards collapsed into the crawl space. One corner of the metal roof had peeled back in some long-ago storm, and rain had been pouring into that corner for years. The front door hung on one hinge. Inside, the smell hit her first: mildew and animal droppings and wet, dying wood. A raccoon family had shredded the mattress in the sleeping loft. Black mold bloomed across one wall like a bruise. But in the back corner, under a filthy canvas tarp, sat her father's workbench. His hand tools still hung on the pegboard above it, each one outlined in faded marker so it could find its way home. Hammers, chisels, hand planes, a level with a cracked bubble. Eleanor stood in that wrecked little house, put her hand on the cold steel of her father's framing hammer, and cried for the first time since the courtroom. Every rational voice in her head said, "Sell it. The land alone might bring $40,000. Take the money, rent a small apartment, find a part-time job, be sensible." Her sister said it. Her daughter said it over the phone from Denver. Even the realtor she called said the structure was a teardown. Eleanor drove back to Knoxville that night, fully intending to list the property, but she couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the pegboard, the marker outlines, the hammer waiting on its hook. Her father had raised her alone after her mother died, a quiet man who fixed everything and complained about nothing. He built that cabin from nothing, and he had left it to her, not to anyone else. 3 days later, Eleanor loaded the Honda with a cooler, a sleeping bag, a case of bottled water, and a $50 box of cleaning supplies, and drove back down that gravel road. She slept the first night in the driver's seat, reclined back, listening to owls in the dark Tennessee woods, terrified and strangely awake. She had never fixed anything more complicated than a leaky faucet, so she started with what she understood: trash bags. She spent a full week just clearing the cabin out, hauling ruined furniture and soaked insulation into a rented dumpster, scrubbing floors on her knees, evicting the raccoons through the hole in the roof they'd been using as a front door. Her arms ached. Her back screamed. She lost 4 pounds and found muscles she hadn't felt in decades. At night, she sat in her car and watched repair videos on her phone. 1 bar of signal, videos buffering endlessly. How to tarp a damaged roof. How to test floor joists for rot. How to kill black mold safely. The local library in town became her second home, and the checkout clerk started setting aside carpentry books when they came in. The town itself was barely a crossroads: a diner, a church, a gas station, and a family-owned hardware store with creaking wood floors. That hardware store is where everything changed. Eleanor came in one morning with a list she'd copied from a video, asking for joist material, and pronounced half the terms wrong. The man behind the counter, instead of laughing, walked her through every item. His name was Dale Mercer, 72 years old, a retired carpenter who'd worked framing crews for 40 years and now killed time at the store because his late wife's absence made his own house too quiet. When Dale heard whose cabin she was fixing, he went still. He had known Walter. They'd traded tools and hunting stories back in the 90s. That Saturday, Dale's pickup came rattling down her gravel road, unannounced, loaded with sawhorses and a circular saw. He looked at the collapsed porch, spat, and said if Walter's daughter was going to do this, she was going to do it right. Dale never took $1, but he took her ignorance personally. He taught her how to read a level, how to sister a rotted joist, how to measure twice and cut once and then check it a third time anyway. Eleanor's hands blistered, then calloused. Her cuts got straighter. By late summer, she had rebuilt the entire front porch herself, pressure-treated boards laid clean and square, and when she drove the last screw, Dale nodded once and said Walter would have called it acceptable. From Dale, that was a standing ovation. If Eleanor's story is getting to you the way it got to me, take 1 second and hit subscribe, because stories like hers get told on this channel every single week. The victories stacked up slowly. The roof corner got new decking and metal panels, Dale on the ladder barking instructions, Eleanor doing the work. The mold wall came down to the studs and went back up new. A wood-burning stove, bought used from a church rummage sale for $80, went in before the first cold snap. The night she cooked her first hot meal inside the cabin, canned chili bubbling on that stove while rain drummed harmlessly on her new roof. Eleanor sat on a paint bucket and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, ownership of the house and of herself. She had no way of knowing that everything she'd just built was about to be tested. The storm came in on a Thursday night, a wall of wind and rain that the radio called the worst in a decade. Eleanor lay in the sleeping loft listening to the cabin groan, and sometime after midnight, a sound like a gunshot cracked through the dark. A dead oak on the property line had snapped and come down across the back corner of the roof, the one section she hadn't yet replaced. Rain poured through the gap. By morning, the back wall she'd rebuilt was soaked, her tools were sitting in an inch of water, and 2 months of work was damaged or destroyed. She stood in the wreckage doing the math again, and the math was brutal. The settlement money was nearly gone. Her savings account held about $900. A tree removal service wanted $600 just to haul the oak away. And her phone was ringing. It was Richard. Somehow, through the kids, he'd heard what she was doing, and his voice had that smooth, managerial tone she now recognized as the sound of him wanting something. He said he'd been thinking that the land had real value, that he knew a developer who bought rural acreage and he could arrange a sale, help her get set up in a nice apartment, somewhere sensible. He said the word sensible twice. He talked to her like she was a problem he was generously offering to handle. Handled. That word again. Eleanor looked out the window at the fallen oak crushing her roofline, at the mud, at the ruin of her work, and for one long moment she almost said yes. She was 58, cold, broke, and exhausted, and quitting was sitting right there in her hand, wrapped in Richard's voice. Instead, she heard herself say something that surprised even her. She told him the property wasn't for sale, thanked him for calling, and hung up. Then she put on her father's old canvas work coat, picked up the chainsaw Dale had taught her to respect, and started cutting that oak into firewood herself. It took her 4 days. She burned that tree in her stove all winter, and every log felt like a small victory over the man who thought she'd fold. The repair after the storm is when she found the letter. Pulling ruined shiplap off the damaged back wall, her pry bar hit something that wasn't wood. Wedged between 2 studs was a coffee can, rusted shut, and inside it, wrapped in plastic, was an envelope. Her father's handwriting again. The letter was dated the year he finished the cabin, and it was addressed to whoever finds this house worth saving. He wrote that he built the place during the worst year of his life, the year after Eleanor's mother died, when he didn't know how to keep going. He wrote that every board he cut gave the grief somewhere to go. And he wrote one line that Eleanor read until she had it memorized. A house you fix with your own hands will hold you up long after the people who let you down are gone. He never knew who would find it, but he could not have written it for anyone but her. Eleanor worked through that winter like a woman possessed, but a calm kind of possessed. Dale helped on the big lifts, and word had spread through town by then, so the hardware store started setting aside returned materials and dented stock at half price, and the diner owner sent her home with soup she never ordered. By March, the tiny home was something out of a magazine. New metal roof in deep green, cedar-trimmed porch with 2 rocking chairs. Inside, 400 square feet of warm wood, a compact kitchen with butcher block counters she milled herself, the loft rebuilt with a real staircase instead of a ladder, and her father's workbench restored in the corner, every tool back on its outline. Something else happened that spring that Eleanor never planned. People started asking to hire her. A woman from church wanted her sagging porch rebuilt. A young couple bought a fixer-upper and wanted honest help, not a contractor who'd talk down to them. Eleanor took the jobs. At 59, she was earning her own money with her own hands for the first time in 3 decades, and she was good at it. Dale told anyone who'd listen that she was the most careful Finnish carpenter in the county, and coming from him, people believed it. Then, on a Saturday in May, a silver Audi came slowly down her gravel road. Richard looked older getting out of that car. Girlfriend from the office was long gone, the kids barely returned his calls, and the big house, the one he'd fought to keep, had become exactly what Eleanor's cabin used to be. Empty, quiet, and slowly falling apart, because Richard had never fixed a thing in his life. Eleanor had done all of that, and he was only now discovering it. He stood at the bottom of her porch steps, the porch she built, and told her the house didn't feel right without her. He said maybe they'd been hasty. He asked, in his roundabout way, whether there was a path back. Eleanor didn't yell. She didn't cry. She sat in her rocking chair on her cedar porch, looked at the man who once slid her life across a table in a manila folder, and told him the truth. She wasn't angry anymore. She was grateful. Because if he hadn't thrown her away, she never would have found out what she was capable of. Then she wished him well, went inside, and closed the door her own hands had hung. Through the window, she watched the Audi back down the gravel road and out of her life. Eleanor Whitfield started this story at a kitchen table she refinished for a man who valued nothing she made. She ends it in a home where every single board answers to her. Richard kept a house, Eleanor built one. And it turns out those are two very different things. Her father was right. A house you fix with your own hands will hold you up long after the people who let you down are gone. Whatever ruin you're staring at in your own life, Eleanor would tell you it's not a teardown, it's a starting point. If this story moved you, there's another one on your screen right now, about a woman who was pushed out of the family business at 60 and started over from a garage. Click it. Eleanor would want you to hear it.